before the storm. Things aren't as they were before. You best start bracing. Did you think you could keep us out? Shut the gates, forget us now. It's hard to change.
Very broadly defined, the culture apparatuses, the kinds of things that get our attention, and then our own accumulated experience. I just want to note here a little caution, which, again, I'll say a bit more about in a bit. Our own accumulated experience becomes increasingly solidified over time. That is, we start to think we know how the world works, and things that accord with that evolving viewpoint we take in much more easily than things that seem to contradict how we think the world works. This evolution is a kind of ongoing process to the extent that we need to understand further and further how the world works. It's also important here to distinguish between what's possible to know and understand firsthand from information that must be delivered second, third, fourth hand by a various media. That is, mediated information, which is more and more the case. I mean, we know less and less about the world firsthand than we do through other sources of information. It is also critical to point out that nothing enters our brains or minds unfiltered. Going back to the idea from Aristotle, the first definition of common sense, that is, the extra sense that allows us to make meaningful what other senses tell us about the world, sidesteps the very important question of how this additional sense is itself built. What I'm suggesting is that part of our acculturation, part of the way we develop a sense of the common sense, is to develop a set of filters that tells us what's important, what's not important, how we should interpret what we get as stimuli. Some of that can be right, some of it can be wrong. So the issue of taken-for-grantedness and reinforcement of common sense is a very important phenomenon. This is, in fact, what I just described. That is, that we begin to filter those things that don't really accord with how we think the world works, and we reject those things that really are contradictory. This is especially the case, I would suggest, and is becoming increasingly the case, through what we think about as either this bubble or silo effect. This is where we're channeled in many of our media interactions, particularly into things that we seem to have already accepted. So, anytime you see a prompt, "If you liked this, you will love that," know that this tactic works according to algorithms that produce this channeling effect. This is happening in all kinds of ways on social media and even in the mainstream media. People are CNN people, or they're MSNBC people, or they are Fox News people. So there's a tendency to sort of silo ourselves, or put ourselves in these bubbles, and that's becoming increasingly the case. Now, an important question. Are we thinking about common sense, singular, or are we thinking about common senses, plural? All too often, one rational being's obvious fact is another's questionable or flat-out wrong assertion. There is more than one common sense, and even seemingly incontrovertible facts have a way of shifting over time. Even for ourselves, something that we may have believed at one point in time, if we are open-minded, we might believe something quite different at a later date. But quite clearly, there are different common senses operating simultaneously. These are the sources of controversy and argumentation. The notion of the single common sense, which all men have in common in any given civilization, is quite foreign to the spirit of the Gramsci prison notebooks. For Gramsci, as for Marx, any given civilization is so fractured by inequality that understanding it requires us to begin with that inequality. Those most elementary things which are the first to be forgot, the fact that there really do exist rulers and ruled, leaders and led. Common sense, in all its multitudinous confusion, is the product of a fractured world. Crean, 2016. Yes, there are multiple common senses operating at any particular time and place. There are always competing common senses at play, which tells us several things. Immediately, it tells us that common sense is unstable. It changes over time. It changes from place to place, from one group, for example, a social class, from one setting to another, and so on. This also tells us that common sense is both malleable and subject to manipulation. It's not a stable thing. Common sense can shift. Let's begin to tie those notions of what common sense is about to political action. Ultimately, as Kate Crean argues, what interests Gramsci is the knowledge that mobilizes political movements capable of bringing about radical transformations. 2016. This is what Gramsci was interested in. One of his central questions was trying to understand how the Italian people came to accept Mussolini and fascism. So he was very interested in coming to grips with that kind of question. The most important knowledge would seem to be, precisely, knowledge that, when embodied in self-aware collectivities, has the potential to act in the world. For Gramsci, the primary such collectivities, as a good Marxist, were classes. He was interested in class struggle. The webs of intelligibility in which our socialization wraps us from the day of our birth are a reality from which we all begin. We are all, to some degree, creatures of popular opinion, and yet, of certain historical moments, there is radical social transformation. When and why does this happen? Running through the Gramsci notebooks is the question, what is the relationship between popular opinion, another phrasing of common sense, and social transformation? How are these things tied together, if they are tied together at all? This was a central question for Gramsci, and one that Marx really did not take up to any significant degree. So, Gramsci is thought of in many ways as a cultural theorist of Marxism. Despite all his criticisms of common sense, and Gramsci was quite critical of it, he thinks of it as a kind of hodgepodge, and he thinks of it as very unsophisticated in many ways. Gramsci's attitude wasn't wholly negative. Embedded within the chaotic confusion of common sense, that is both home and prison, he identifies what he terms buon senso, good sense. Crean, 2016. That is, we feel comfortable in our notion of common sense, but we're also bounded by it. That's home and prison in this case. And there's a kernel of good sense in common sense. The phrase being philosophical about it, in addition to calling for patience or resignation, can also be seen, and it was for Gramsci, as an invitation for people to reflect and to realize fully that whatever happens is basically rational and must be confronted as such. This is the way in which good sense can be extracted out of common sense, but it's a process. It's a process that Gramsci says has to be extracted, made coherent by intellectuals, that this is the role of intellectuals for Gramsci. But he has a very ecumenical notion of intellectuals. Anyone in Gramsci's view, given the opportunity, could be an intellectual, that is, a person who could reflect on the conditions of their own material existence and think about why that existence has the characteristics that it does. So, for Gramsci, anyone could be an intellectual. The role of intellectuals is to extract the good sense out of the hodgepodge of common sense. Gramsci thinks about intellectuals as falling roughly into two categories. Organic intellectuals are those that remain connected to their class and further class interests. Now, by saying that doesn't necessarily mean of one sort of political stripe or another. Adam Smith, the classical economist, I would argue, is an organic intellectual for his class, the bourgeois class. Traditional intellectuals, as Gramsci describes them, are people who are interested in being apologists or explainers or supporters of the status quo. The traditional intellectuals are also what Marx would have called the vulgar economists, with whom he was engaged in conversation and contention. So the role of intellectuals is to extract the kernels of good sense out of common sense. Okay, now, let me turn from the abstract for a minute and think about a concrete example of something that we think about as common sense, which we will come back to in certain ways through other parts of the course. So, as common sense, the American dream. If I say that phrase, do you get a picture in your mind immediately? What does it look like? The American dream. Here it is. In America, and this is not just confined to America, of course, if you work hard, play by the rules, you will succeed. Work hard, play by the rules, you will succeed. That's part of the dream. Typically, it also includes a metric for what constitutes success. It almost invariably takes a commodified form, success, since that's the kind of reward a capitalist system can and must deliver. For example, a recurrent formulation is a home of one's own. Now, I don't want to go very far into a discussion of why this particular measure of success, that is, a home of one's own in the suburbs and so forth, was the preferred form of connoting and illustrating the American dream, but it had a great deal to do with the rise of mass consumption. The phrase itself, the American dream, was coined in the 30s, basically in the heart of the Depression. Much of this framing was pointed at the need to keep the economy rumbling at a great pace when World War II ended. So one of the ways in which industry could keep going was to promulgate not collective consumption, but individual consumption. So everybody had to have their own house, and consequently everybody had to have their own Kelvinator, their own appliances. You couldn't share these things in common. That wasn't enough market. So the American dream takes a particular, that is, a commodified form. The American dream, as common sense, also has some taken-for-granted presumptions underlying it. The first is that America is a meritocracy, that is, a system in which people's success in life depends on their talents, abilities, and efforts. This is one of the presumptions underlying the notion that if you work hard, play by the rules, you will succeed. There's an ethos of individual achievement. You get this on your own, the self-made man, the self-made woman. This translates into a number of other societies. Some of you may remember the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. One of her many, many quotable quotes was, "There is no such thing as society," spoken as she was dismantling British society at the time. There is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women. And then it's kind of, after that and their families, okay if you can keep them together under those circumstances. Another tacit presumption is that the rules are fair and are known or knowable to all, that is, that we operate on a level playing field. If these presumptions are violated, then the formulation of the American dream is very much in jeopardy. But if we presume that these things are the case, then we might be persuaded that the American dream is, in fact, a viable conception of society. But I'm not going to suggest, I'm just going to say there's an obverse meaning to take away from the common sense understanding of how our society operates. That obverse meaning is this. In America, if you don't succeed, you are either not working hard enough or you are not playing by the rules, or both. So, if you don't succeed, and this is the obverse of thinking about the American dream as it's laid out, essentially, your failure is your own fault. This is another corollary of the individualized notion of how society works. All the opportunities are there. If you fail, it is your fault. There is nothing structural or systemic or unfair getting in your way, either historically, contemporaneously, or into the future. Let's think about these presumptions and the obverse for a minute. How can you work hard if there are no jobs for you? Which is increasingly the prospect as we think about the export of jobs that has occurred, as we think about automation taking jobs away, as we think about productivity going up, but the demand for labor going down. One of the problems might be, well, I'd like to work hard, I just can't find work. Or what if your job pays so poorly that despite working very hard, and sometimes at more than one job at a time, you still can't make ends meet? So the pay structure doesn't allow success.